I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old girl, so that's the Frozen just context there for just for reference. All right, so what's that? There you go. So most people here have seen me talk before about autopsy, but the past year or so, or a few years, we've been working on cyber triage. It's all about kind of automating incident response. And honestly, the quick background behind that this product is 3 or 4 years ago at this event, sitting at a talk, and someone was talking about sysinternals tools and command line tools and how to get up an incident response program with this. And it occurred to me I think I gave that talk 12 years ago about this kind of stuff and how there's kind of this wide gap of tools for people that were kind of the very do-it-yourself ad hoc to the crazy automated and enterprise stuff, and there wasn't really much in the middle. So that kind of motivated this. But as Heather mentioned in the program, I do have that doctor in front of my name, so I had this somewhat of an academic bent to me, and I was thinking through of frameworks and coming up with some kind of framework in my head for how to think about things to then kind of build stuff. And so the whole idea of how do we automate triage and response has kind of forced me to start thinking about what does it really mean to automate incident response? And can you just automate the entire thing? Or what can we automate? What can we automate? So this talk is kind of more about my at least process of trying to think through of what does it look like to come up with how we come up with a framework for thinking about where we automate incident response and how this comes out with this. Caveat, I'm going to fail on some regard in this presentation because when I submitted it, it was all about interactivity. And so my goal actually is get people's experiences and thoughts and feedbacks and opinions on kind of automation experiences with that, but we have 30 minutes. So either it's going to be a crazy interactive talk and we're not going to get through half of it, or we'll get through it all and no one will talk and I'll fail in that regard. So I'm going to let you guys pick I don't really care. So we can interact or not interact, but I'm going to fail in some regard. I realize that. So, all right. So goals for the session. We're talking about automation, where it's used, do you need it, is it worth it? Feel free to shout and argue, interactive, and all those kinds of things here. So basic agenda, come up with a kind of a framework here, dive into a couple of steps to think about automation, and then maybe we get to it, talk about kind of the overall, what can a typical company do, or maybe we'll jump around as part of this. There's a whole lot more content here. There's some on the Cyber Triage blog about automation stuff if you want to read more, but again, we're going to try and get stuff wrapped into here, kind of a quick, we're running out of time here. I'm wasting time here. So what is automation? Basics first here. There's a lot of definitions. If you Google for automation definition, you'll read stuff that makes no sense to applying it to incident response. Because it's all about manufacturing and automating manufacturing and assembly lines, and the terms they use are I'm not sure what this means for what I do. There's a great blog by John Allspa, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's the CTO of Etsy, and he has this great blog series on automating IT. He's not a security guy, not a response guy, but it's kind of great series on the history of automation and various kind of approaches for automation. It's a great read if you really care about automation stuff. My very simple definition we're going to use today is when the computer does the next step without human intervention, that's automation. So, everyone good with that? Sounds good? All right. Well, if that's the case, then this is automation. Because this guy is doing some stuff here. And so as you're talking about automation solutions, you can buy a cat and try and work that out. Question though, hold on, the magic 8 balls. So we're giving out magic 8 balls at our booth, right? Instead of actually investigating a computer, you shake it, you ask the question, and it tells you the answer. Is this automation? Yeah? No? What's that? Yeah, there's human interaction with the shaking. And there's no computer. To go back to the other, there's a computer to get involved here, so we made it very close. Although, to the sidestep, I'm going to kill myself for running out of time here, but so many people who see this think there's a computer involved here. There's some people who've never seen a Magic 8 Ball before, and they want to know how it knows the answer, or they think there's a touch screen on here. So people do think that there's a computer in here, and there actually knows an involvement, but yeah, this is not a Russian. If you want with these, we got plenty at the booth. We don't want to fly back with them. All right, let's get back on. So, levels of automation. Expectations change over the years, and I was reminded by this by Andy's talk this morning. But 15 plus years ago, automation in forensics incident response was all about just reducing steps, right? So the basic version of Ncase was referred to as automated because you didn't have to bust open the command line and give some arguments, and it basically reduced the command line arguments you gave, and that was kind of level of automation. Jesse Kornblum long ago had a floppy disk program at a conference. There was like a batch script in some programs, and that was kind of the automated incident response effort was kind of at that level, and just kind of automated the programs, right? So back then, that was the automation that was there. Now we have much higher expectations of what to get out of that. Here's an example, not to get too in the weeds of all this other kind of more academic stuff here, but this is like a list of 10 different levels of automation that some people have defined out there for various things, ranging from it's all manual to it's all automated to everything in between of, the computer offers you all the options, or the computer narrows it down, or the computer narrows it down and suggests one, or the computer narrows it down and suggests one and actually picks one for you, et cetera, various levels of detail. This is great for some levels, but we don't need it for today. So we're just going to use 3 levels, which is manual, partial, with some human involvement, and fully, which means there's kind of no human interaction. So everyone good with that? Yeah? All right. So when should we automate? I couldn't really find a concise answer or idea for this, right? But here's my basic thought on this, that you want to choose the highest level of automation, from manual to partial to fully automated, or the other 10 levels in there. You want to choose the highest level that has the benefit of performance automatically versus like the manual. That's the whole definition we have, is doing it automatic. So the benefit of doing it automatically is higher than is it the latest one? This is the latest one, I think. And this is the latest one. But I've been changing this definition for a bit here. But basically, the benefit is better than the risk of the mistake. So mistakes are going to happen, right? So what is the impact if the mistake happens from the automated thing, and the impact of that, and the likelihood of that, as well as the cost, right? So the more the complex the automation gets, the more hardware you need, the more software you need, the more maintenance you need, and what is your budget and what is the overall cost for doing that? So the basic idea here, right, is what are you going to get as a benefit from doing this? What's going to happen when a mistake happens, and how likely is the mistake to happen? And the final thing is, can you actually afford this, a simple or complex kind of automation here? So, we good so far? Sure? Everyone agree? All right. That's the problem with this definition. The question was, is it quantifiable? And that's the problem with this, of how do you actually quantify the benefit versus the cost versus the mistakes, and it's subjective. I'll get to that. So now we're bringing this back to incident response. So many people here probably think about incident response in some form of phases of identification, containment, investigation, eradication, recovery. I'm sure if you haven't seen these yet, you'll see them this week in a SANS course. But this is kind of the usual way people think about incident response as part of this. For me, I find it hard to think about kind of automation at this level of, can you automate containment? Can you automate eradication? It seems kind of a bit more abstract and fuzzy. So I think about it a different way. So I tend to think of this as incident response breaks into 2 kind of categories of things. One's investigation work, and the other's mitigation work. And investigation is basically, you got a bunch of questions, and you're collecting and analyzing data to answer those questions. This is basically identification, investigation phases, or you're mitigating, right? You're basically taking actions to reduce your risk or fix the problems. This is the containment, eradication, and recovery phases. So basically, those 5 phases from before can basically merge into these 2 ideas of you're investigating or you're mitigating. So, good? Disagree? We good with that? All right. So investigation, we'll dive in a bit more. So common questions, right? And maybe some of you think about these ways, subconsciously or not, but I mean, in general, if you're investigating, you got to know why you're investigating, right? You got to have some kind of question that you're looking for. So triage, you're usually asking, is a computer compromised? How badly? Some very high-level questions about a computer is part of that triage step, right? Maybe you're doing deep dive, you're trying to find out who it was, when it was, why they did it, where they went, and kind of more of those kind of questions. Maybe you're hunting and you're asking for, what do the computers have this file? But generally, anything you're doing, you should have some idea of what question you're trying to answer as part of this. General process, right? Define the questions you care about. Think about how you're going to answer that question, right? What data do you need to answer that question to prove it wrong or prove it or right? You get that data, you analyze it, and then you see if it answers your questions, or you need to do more work and kind of rinse and repeat. But at a high level, this is kind of the way you kind of go through this process, right, of trying to investigate these things. We're going to dive down a little bit more, just because, I guess I find at least kind of the more narrowed down you get with this, you can actually start think about automating a bit easier than the kind of these bigger abstract phases as part of this. So we don't have time for this to go into much more, but you can think through actually collection breaks down into a couple other phases of, you've got the question, you got to figure out what data you want to get to support that. You got to find out, what data types is it? Is it volatile data? Is it registry? Is it going to be in processes? Is it going to be in the network? Where's it going to be? What host is it on? So you got to come up with some process of how do I answer this question? Where's that data? What kind of data is it? And then you actually go reach out and get that data, whatever software you have to get that. And then you analyze it. There's a whole bunch of analysis techniques out there. I'm sure there's some machine learning data specialists who will laugh at the stuff that I'm talking about here, but this is basically, I kind of break this into a few categories of, there's the known bad analysis, right? There's the IOCs, there's the signatures, there's the RO rules, where you're basically comparing the item against something you've seen before, and is this the same thing? Or there's the typically bad, right? The things that are more often than not bad, but they could be good, right? Programs running out of app data, usually bad unless you're, WebEx or Chrome or some of those kind of things, but generally it's bad that things are running out of app data. Or the anomalies are the users in the wrong folder, right? Users doing stuff they shouldn't be doing. It's just kind of abnormal for that kind of enterprise. But these are kind of the techniques that we apply for all these things as part of that. The quick note there, if you're trying to hopefully now people are trying to map out kind of how does this apply to what I do, right? What is my process, and is this actually map, or is this guy just freaking crazy as part of this? One thing to point out here, if you have continuous monitoring, right, your data collection's already been chosen, right? You basically already decided that you're going to answer these kind of questions, so you're collecting from these given hosts and this kind of data to kind of help this process of what are you actually collecting is part of that. So let's do an example here. So you have some kind of command and control alert, from a SIM or IPS or something that's coming on. You have your network device, you have some traffic, alerts go off, tickets get made, whatever. The question you're then asked to respond to is, what's going on in the laptop? Why is this laptop talking to some CNC server, out in the internet, right? What is the process doing there? What's going on in that laptop? So going through this process, right? Identify the system. This is pretty easy, right? It's the laptop. We know that. What's the data types? Depending on what you know about why people reach out to CNC servers, you may want to get volatile data, the startup items, scheduled tasks, the things where all the kind of malware programs exist and persist. Maybe some user activity on there. But you can kind of identify the data types you need to answer that question. You go get it, and you bring it back and do your analysis of the known bads, the typically bad, the suspicious things as part of that. Good? Yeah? Makes sense? Yeah? Okay. So back to the framework, right? So we all basically agree on this general process of how we're doing the investigation, the steps are. We can now apply the framework to see if this actually makes sense or not. So just a review, right? The framework is all about, what are the benefits of automating that step compared to doing it manually? What is the cost to automate it in terms of all the complexity it's going to require to fully automate? And how likely is a mistake to happen, and what's going to happen when that mistake actually does happen? So for not this is kind of the best step to automate, but just because it's kind of the most logical process, we'll start with the first one, which is identify the target system, right? Where are we going to get the data from to answer our questions that we're investigating? So the idea of automating this would be automatically identify, what remote system that we want to get data based off of. And the theory here is that we need to be efficient. We can't just collect all data, obviously, from every system. So we need to base this on the investigation type that we're doing and what questions are being asked. Is it a triage question, or is it a deep dive kind of question, or what specifically we're trying to answer as part of this? So it's scenarios here, right? We go back to that example before. We have an alert about some command and control traffic. Automatically identifying is that laptop we should collect from. That's an easy one. Another one, though, is that maybe during your investigation, you come across some host references in remote desktop or event log, and you want to know, should we automatically analyze those, right? In theory, if you're going to care about those hosts as part of your investigation, your tools could automatically find a reference to those hosts from remote desktop, reach out to them, pull that data back, so that when you care about it, that data is already there, sitting there for you as part of that, and you just kind of reduce the whole process from this. So, kind of questions, right? Who actually does this? Who has some level of automation now that's basically automatically picking the system to collect from as part of their response? Anyone? Couple hands? With like SIMs, basically SIM integration and kind of target collection stuff. So for all alerts, or just kind of some alerts? So for all types of alerts, or just some kinds of alerts? Yeah. Okay. So it's a subset of alerts. Okay. So who would want this? Who would want a kind of system that automatically collected stuff, based on alerts, or as you're poking through in the registry and it finds references and automatically pulls that stuff in, as part of that? Who thinks it'd be cool? Yeah? Yeah? Take that? Okay. So let's go through the framework. So what are the benefits, right? So the benefits of this would be speed, right? You're reducing the time to when collection actually starts. So if you had this kind of system, you'd reduce your overall kind of collection investigation time, quite a bit as part of that, maybe quite a bit. What are the mistakes? Well, when this fails, or if it fails, the impact is you're either A, going to collect data you didn't need to collect, because you're going to be overzealous and start pulling data back from computers you ever needed to, right? The impact on that is going to be on that endpoint, that you're going to have a performance impact on that endpoint, maybe some on the server. If it's coming back to a server, you're going to put load on that server you may not need to, which could be impacting kind of more important investigations. And there could be a storage impact, right? So it's kind of more of a resource impact when you screw up, or if it screws up with this step. The other impact is we don't actually collect it, right? We decide we don't collect it, and we don't have that data available, and we have to start it manually as part of that. Question? Yep. Yep. So are you saying it's a benefit or a risk? Because that to me seems like a benefit that you could get it quickly. Yeah. So just so you ever hear that, right? The other benefit I mentioned here is that if you do it quickly, you could get volatile data that could roll over otherwise by doing that right away. That if you actually take 30 minutes or whatever to get someone to get assigned to this, it could be gone by this. It's a good point. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. The second comment people can hear was, the overall other risk of this is that data gets pulled back. Could have PII on that. Now your collection place has more of that data in there. I would guess that most places have that kind of stuff in there as well. But it's a fair point that you could have more of that, increasing the risk of the likelihood of exposure of that. Yeah. Yeah. Corner. Yeah, the question was whether automation and not having a human involved, I think it was saying removes you from the compliance issues or changes the compliance issues. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Anyone know? Okay. He says no. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So summary there, I think, was keep data in the country, and it's really important when someone reads it versus collects it. Is that okay? Cliff Notes version. Okay. Is that 10? Okay. Sorry, because the lights. All right, we are way behind. That's fine. This is good. See, I'm failing on the duration. So think about the cost of this, right? If you actually had a system that was fully automated, which means that the computer decides based on the incident and based on the questions, I would propose it's a really high cost to get a system that's smart enough to know this is the question we're asking, this is how we answer it, and this is where we're going to find this stuff, right? It needs to know all about your network, about where the various data is, and how to kind of answer various questions, where the data or systems will be relevant to that. I guess it's going to be crazy expensive to do. But it's fairly low cost, though, for limited situations. To point out kind of some sim examples of if you have certain sim alerts that you know you're going to investigate, and you know it's a triage question, and it's not all questions, then you can kind of hone this in very much more closely of we're going to fully automate X, Y, and Z, and everything else is more of a manual partial. The partial automation would be the computer finds references to remote systems, and the human decides. Right, so this is actually quite a bit of SOCs do this, where the first-year SOC person actually looks at all the alerts and does a quick sanity check on them, and then hits the button to go. And I'd say it's more of a partial automation, where there's some human review there of making a decision to go or not, and the computer actually executes that collection as part of that. Or the equivalent on that whole remote desktop event logging example of if you're going through the case and you find these references in the computer, that the system then automatically then kind of asks you to collect these places or not. So we'll skip over that. Sure. So you're proposing more of the we should always just do it. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yep. Okay. Yep. 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 Fair enough. Yep. Did we get that? Basically arguing that the humans aren't cheap. I think is that the cost there is more of a software hardware cost, not the human capital, I guess, cost, right? Yeah, so. Abnormal analysis was another one I had in here, kind of more of the anomaly analysis, the looking at data that's not normal. We can get on the whole breakdown of this, but we can probably skip over this. But the basic idea is the computer being able to get that data back and automatically analyze it to find out, is the user accessing network shares they shouldn't be, or suspicious startup items, or suspicious local user accounts. Basically kind of trying to figure the stuff out that isn't known to be bad, isn't usually bad, but it's just kind of abnormal for that system of, trying to automate that kind of analysis on this. Anybody here have that kind of analysis? Yeah. Couple people? This is kind of where a bunch of the detection stuff is going into, of kind of learning user profiles and behaviors and kind of flagging as part of that. Some of the benefits here, in theory, we should be able to answer stuff faster because we have that. It could be more accurate just because it's hard for humans to know what normal is. But if we're collecting data all the time, as part of that, it's a bit easier to kind of know what normal is, so we can find the outliers, the abnormal. The mistakes, though, are a bit higher. I think the risk is higher than in the collection one, targeted collection one, which is we could miss data, right? Or we could be flagging the wrong false positives, missing things because of that a human may have found as part of that. Costs here, again, I'd say it's a fairly high cost to be kind of the fully automated computer knows everything about what's normal or not normal, watching everything, knowing what a user is, what their profile is, what they should be doing. This can be a fairly high cost in terms of overall monitoring and storage and maintenance, all those kind of capabilities. But some of partial there, so let's skip over that. There's a whole bunch of others. My initial version of this deck had like I think 60 slides in it because it was like going down all the various things, and I realized people are going to fall asleep here halfway through this. So there's again, this is more what's on the blog, but this is the basic idea, kind of going through each of these phases of pick the system, pick the data types, do the collection, do the analysis of their various types here, and trying to figure out does this make sense to automate or not, or is this just going to be kind of a waste. So what can a typical company do? So this is kind of my conclusion from kind of going through this process of kind of some of the summaries of what kind of typical company can do. Now, I'm going to assume that this is the kind of the typical company profile. And this is based on more of, I think, not necessarily the audience here of people that come to this event, but more of like the more average company who's not sending their people here. But the typical company is, in some ways, more interested in triaging their stuff because they outsource to consultants all the deep dive stuff. So their internal interest is much more on the, do I care about this and how much, and then I'm going to hire my consultants and outsource this if I really have to get involved with this. And they don't have a huge investment yet in some kind of orchestration automation platform to kind of know what's normal and monitor things as part of that. They're basically just trying to get by with detection and some prevention and maybe some basic kind of response in that. So that's kind of my basic assumption. Who here fits in that category? Who's going to admit it? I'm not sure if this audience is the right audience. I think the people here I'm assuming are a bit beyond this, but this is kind of more my assumption for the base of the sum. So automation for 99%. I kind of borrowed this phrase from Anton at Gartner. He came back from RSA this year, basically on one of his blogs. His comment was, RSA is basically security for the 1%, right? The people who can afford all this crazy stuff, but most companies, aren't even near kind of stuff being there. So, what can like the typical kind of average company, try and focus on first for overall automation? I'd say step one is fully automate the steps that don't require decisions, right? Whenever you have to get a decision made by the computer, that's when the mistakes happen, right? Or they're more likely to happen and make some false, judgments based on that. So, focus on ones that have the low cost and low risk of mistakes. I propose these kind of things are doing the collection. So if the human actually picks the computer to collect from, and the human picks the data types to go for that, but actually having the computer reach out and do the collection, all that kind of stuff, right? Perfect, right? Everyone should do that. Most people are doing that. As part of that, it's been kind of one of the long tried and true steps of that, so that's good. IOC analysis, right? The known bads, right? That should be done as well. I mean, kicked off here. So that's good. Who's doing this? Most people are. It's good. Like 5 minutes? All right. Step two, I would say, is to automate the easier decisions, right? So some ways like the abnormal analysis, right? It's one of those things that you just can't really easily do at scale with some of the things, but having a computer kind of, partially automate this for you and having you be able to review these things and not necessarily rely on the computer to make all the decisions, but at least help with that. I think it's kind of one of the next important steps if you have the right software to do that. I don't think it'll ever be fully automated. That's one of the things that will always be kind of a partial automation. And the next one is kind of this choosing target and data types, based on the alert types and based on certain things. Just because it's low risk if you collect it, generally low risk if you collect it, and it's also the benefits of the speed as well as some of that volatility as mentioned before. Step 3, go to the actual execution of mitigation. We skipped the whole mitigation topic. Remember before there was like incident responses, mitigation, investigation. We skipped mitigation, but basically I think mitigation breaks down to kind of picking the mitigation plan and then doing it, executing it. I would say automate the execution of the mitigation plan as kind of a next step of being able to have a central kind of screen in place that should be able to mitigate these things and block off computers, block off users as part of that automation. And then the last one would be, choosing the mitigation approach, letting the computer actually choose the mitigation approach because that's got the high risk of blocking people and users' accounts automatically, for all situations for some of these various things. There's a whole lot more. There's a whole lot more that we didn't get talked about as part of this, such as like, how do you get people to trust automation, right? Automation is one of these scary things that people, don't really want to trust. It's going to do the wrong thing. The blog post I mentioned before has a whole section on like the history of getting people to trust automation and techniques for that. Things just like showing intermediate steps so that people can understand what's going on behind the scenes versus kind of hiding a lot of that stuff. So there's kind of techniques there for making sure you do that. And what are the risks? One of the big risks of too much automation, right, is that the easy automation is the stuff that are the easy tasks to kind of automate, right? People get rusty, right? People don't learn the basics because all the basics are being done for them. But at some point, you're going to get some kind of advanced incident or advanced problems where the automation falls apart. And do you then have the people who remember how to do all of those kind of basic tedious things anymore, or they've forgotten all that, which is kind of one of these challenges of you can automate this, but do you really want to automate this for kind of the long-term, growth and kind of being able to sure everyone knows what to actually do with this. There's more at the blog, if you want stuff. That's it. Oh, and my last reminder, I put there to remind myself. OSGFCon, our open source conference, in October. Voting is still open until Monday, so we do crowdsourced voting. So you go to osgfcon.org until Monday, and you can vote on talks and see who's there. There's some people in the audience I think who submitted talks as well, so vote for them. All right. I think I finished on time and had questions. I think maybe I didn't fail at all. It's good. Other questions? Do we have time, or am I kicked out? Okay.
First question, you talked about having that, like the middle of the problem be automate away things that don't require a decision point.
Yep.
What's even like step 0, right? I mean, if you were going to automate something, if you had to pick one thing and automate it, what would it be? Where would you start in that decisionless body of things you could automate?
I think the most minimal thing, right, is the actual being able to automate the collection, right? Being able to automate, for most cases, right, I care about this kind of data and being able to kind of have the script to do that, right? So having whether it's PowerShell or Python or some other kind of commercial tool to be able to do that if I'm going to get my basic, honestly, triage kind of questions, right, of having that as an automated step versus, having someone having to type in PS list -a, whatever, and kind of all the various things as part of that. That to me is the minimum, and I think most people have that, right? Because just kind of it's the easiest thing to do. So to me, that's kind of ground zero.
Yeah. Second question is, do you want to build a snowman?
Don't want to what?
Build a snowman.
Good, I like that.
All right, thank you.